Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So, the Unjerked podcast is affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is,
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or jabd.com.
and this episode, we're going to talk about crime. We're not going to talk about white collar crime or public corruption or police reform. We're specifically talking about what people think of when they hear the word crime, which is violent crime, property crime, etc. And essentially what causes it and how can you effectively reduce it. We're also not going to go too deep into criminal justice reform, like how do we reduce, how do we have like better equality in terms of, people from different backgrounds being treated the same. These are all important things, but there's a certain scope we have to pick for each episode, so we're kind of narrowly focusing specifically on more or less violent and property crime, and how to reduce it and what causes it.
So we're not including scammers or online piracy.
I think scammers count too. I think.
Okay.
I think
you're going to go with scammers.
Crimes that affect. I think crimes that affect day-to-day life. Yeah. I think a lot of them.
So we'll draw the line at corporateness if it's corporate behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, because I just think it's kind of an entirely different animal. There's a whole entirely different discussion when you get to that point. So we might do an episode on that in the future. But, for now, we'll focus on more of a limited scope. So we're going to talk about crime. What are some things people say about crime?
It's about poverty or wealth inequality. And I did see something that actually was a well-referenced comment that pointed to transitional areas in between lower income and higher income neighborhoods, and how people were pointing to just that inequality as a reason for crime. Why would you do crime if people were all on one footing, economically speaking? And then also, I found a few Reddit posts. I'm like, why did you do crime personally? And a lot of people were like, because selling dope was a lot more profitable than working at the Gap.
Yeah, I mean, those aren't entirely off base. There is a significant economic sort of background as far as crime goes. And I think the caveat to that is obviously there's cases where there's like rich college kids who, before we continue, just a caveat, this is like not an episode for kids. We're not going to get graphic, but we are talking about crime. So, yeah. So, there are cases we all know about, like some rich college kid who assaults someone and gets away with it and stuff. But practically speaking, like, how often do, rich upper middle class kids like murder people? It just doesn't happen often. And there's, a pretty interesting kind of reason behind that. So that's something we'll be talking about. I do think there's definitely an economic component to it, but there's also a law enforcement component to it. And I think both of those things need to be balanced in order to reduce crime. So we're not going to talk, like I said before, we're not going to talk about corruption, white collar crime, and we're not going to talk about, like, let's say there's civil rights protesters who are like breaking the law on purpose. Like, okay, that's technically a crime, but like that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about aggravated assault, murder, larceny, burglary. The things you think about when you hear the word crime is kind of what we're going to talk about. So when you look at the international...
download a car, so don't steal music.
So when it comes to the international picture of crime, there's a clear trend where essentially what you tend to see is that countries with weak institutions and a lot of political instability have very high crime rates. That's not very surprising. Specifically, Latin America, there's a few exceptions within Latin America, like Chile has a lower crime rate. I believe Panama has a lower crime rate. But there's, very high crime rates in many parts of Latin America. And that it's
urbanized is Chile?
I think
feel
it's
like
pretty
they're not.
urbanized. Well, I don't
Really?
think they're rural
Huh.
because they're a mountainous country, so I don't think most people probably live in
Yeah.
cities.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that because there was one Grand Tour. Oh no, this was pre-Grand Tour. It was a Top Gear episode where they go through Chile, and it was so mountainous and rural that they basically gave up and went through Argentina. So that's my only impression of Chile, was that one Top Gear episode.
I don't know how urbanized Chile is.
I mean, I bring it up because I feel like it's that old adage, if you mug someone in a forest, did it happen?
Chile is actually a very wealthy country by Latin American standards, much more than
Really?
other parts. Significantly,
I'm gonna
more.
have to do a Wikipedia dive on this.
It's I think it's definitely near the top when it comes to. They do have inequality issues, but like it's definitely near the top when it comes to GDP and just overall well-being. But I think the trend you see is, sub-Saharan Africa does have issues with crime. Latin America also has issues with crime. I believe Latin America actually has a higher murder rate. And the area in the U.S., Europe, Western Europe specifically, Northern and Western Europe have very low crime rates. East Asia has even lower crime rates. Places like Japan, China, etc., have pretty low. Taiwan, South Korea, etc. They have low crime rates. The U.S. has moderate crime rates. When you compare it to other developed countries, it's obviously higher, and that's the thing. Whenever people criticize the U.S., they're always comparing it to a very small subset of developed countries. When you look at an international perspective, it's pretty moderate. Obviously, when you compare it to Western Europe and East Asia, there's a higher crime rate. Interestingly enough, the divergence in crime rates happened in the 1850s between the U.S. and Europe. So when you actually
Did that happen in terms of the U.S.'s crime went up, or did Europe's crime go down?
I think it was more Europe was going down, I think.
Oh,
I'm not completely sure
but
about
ours
that.
stayed the same.
Yeah, I think that's what happened. So
I wonder if that has anything to do with 48. Because when the revolutions happened in 48, thanks Mike Duncan for the explainer. If you haven't listened to that podcast, it's great. A lot of the Europeans that didn't like how the revolutions failed moved to the U.S. So basically we got all the radicals, which is also, fun fact, a big part of the abolitionist movement was from radical German immigrants.
Interesting. Well, I know Quakers were also a big abolitionist group. But you did see, it says here, the drop in violent crime in the U.S. after about 1850 was not as fast or as consistent as it was in Western Europe, and that is when the striking violence gap opened up. So this happened, or this is from this Berkeley article, and it is interesting, whatever the reason, there was this gap that happened starting in the 1850s, and then that's really why the U.S. is higher. And then when you look at the rest of the world, it varies. Like I said, like if there's instability or war, crime is just higher, or what are considered criminal acts. I mean, like the typical things like murder and stuff like that are higher. A good case in point is in the Middle East. A lot of Middle Eastern countries actually have very low crime rates. Places like Saudi Arabia have relatively low crime rates, but places that other countries in the region which have gone through wars recently, obviously, have issues with crime. And so even within the context of a specific region, there's notable differences. So that's kind of how things shake up between the different parts of the world. When it comes to like the big picture history of how crime rates have gone, there's an entire book about this. Steven Pinker, he's a Harvard professor, and he wrote an entire he wrote an entire book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which talks about the history of violence and violent crime and all sorts of other issues. Basically, his thesis is that things are better now than they ever have been. The counterpoint, so Peter Thiel, famous venture capitalist, said in a speech that basically, yes, the kinetic energy of violence is a lot lower, but the potential energy is a lot higher. Like now we have nukes, and so they haven't been used after World War II, but if they do get used, it could be horrific. Or separate from that, there's, climate change could cause serious issues, and so there's potential energy when it comes to things that could go wrong. But the actual kinetic energy of like actual amount of violence happening is actually significantly lower now than it used to be. So there's a Pew Research article that basically looks into crime over time, and the common perception, and tell me if you agree, the common perception when you listen to people talk is that crime is getting worse, and it's like, things that are the worst they've ever been, or things are really, really bad. Is that kind of what you hear people say when it comes to crime?
I mean, that's kind of how anyone approaches any topic. Well, I mean, it always goes, oh my gosh, this is the worst it's ever been in all of the world. There's so many wars. There's so much crime. And then some Poindexter in the corner goes, well, actually, it's the lowest it's ever been if you actually look at the statistics.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
that's usually how those interactions go.
I'm going to be that Poindexter right now. So according to this Pew Research poll, like if you look at starting, compared to 1993 all the way to 2019, across the board, crime has gone down across virtually all categories. Violent crime rate, property crime rates, victimization per household in those categories. Crime has just gone down over the past 30 years significantly. Like it's like not, it's essentially an open and shut case. Like it is undeniable that crime is very, very low right now. Like very, very low. And this is not just over the past couple decades. When you look at the super long term, there's, the Berkeley article I mentioned earlier, they looked at, okay, what is the long-term homicide rate? And I'm not completely sure about, I think the further back you go, the more difficult it gets to kind of find the data basically. But there's ways that researchers basically, extrapolate and kind of or interpolate and determine, what do we think the murder rate was at these times? And it's pretty obvious. There's a graph that talks about the long-term trend in homicide rate starting around 1700. And it's just, there's some spikes, it's not a straight line. It's kind of a jagged line, but the trend is clearly down. Like so the estimated homicide rate was over 30 people. I don't know if this was like out of every 10,000 or 100,000 people. I believe it's per 100,000 people. But the estimate for 1700 was over 30 people. And right now it's roughly 6 people per 100,000.
Well, that's good.
So things were people were a lot more violent back in the day. And I mean, even when you think about, political history, think about, if someone insulted you, the remedy was to like agree to shoot each other, in a very sort of formalized, I mean, that's what a duel is. You're like, okay, well, like you talk smack about me, so we're going to have to shoot each other now. And they formalized it by saying like, oh, we have to have seconds and we have to, follow these rules. But at the end of the day, you're like basically like potentially murdering each other because someone insulted someone. And like, that's completely unthinkable
now most duels incorporate Yu-Gi-Oh cards.
Yeah. So the murder rate, like, similar to the crime rate in general, the murder rate is going down. When you look at, when you look at other crimes as well, when it comes to property crimes, there's also a pretty clear trend. This is based off of FBI data. But when you look at property crimes, it kind of went up from the 60s all the way to like the 80s, basically, and then it's been declining since the 90s, essentially. And that's for larceny, burglary, motor vehicle theft, etc. And some example, some sort of context. So, do you know the difference between larceny, burglary, robbery, any of that stuff?
I do not know the difference between larceny, burglary, and what was the other one?
And robbery.
Robbery. I imagine burglary is you sneak into someone's place and take something. Robbery is you do it in public. Larceny, I don't know what that is.
So I think the difference is robbery entails some sort of either use of violence or threat of violence, using a gun, for example. So robbery is specifically, using force or coercion to take something from someone. Burglary is basically entering a home without the violence part, basically breaking in when someone's out of town or whatever. And then larceny is more generally not in someone's home, but just stealing in general.
So pickpocketing, is that larceny?
Yeah. Okay. And obviously robbery is a much more serious crime because of the violence or threat of violence involved. Larceny is much less common. When it comes to like what kind of crimes actually happen, and when it comes to the frequency of these crimes. So, I mean, overwhelmingly most, the biggest crime is larceny, by far. It's essentially 5 times more common than the next more common thing, which is burglary, which is also a form of theft. And then after that is aggravated assault, which is, pretty obvious what that is. And then motor vehicle theft is next, robbery after that, and then rape after that, and then murder and manslaughter after that. And so, it is obviously murder is, the worst type of crime, or one of the worst, depending on, I think it's the worst thing you can do is to murder someone. But most crime is not murder. Most crime is pickpocketing, breaking into someone's car and taking their stuff. That's what happens the most, typically speaking. And when it comes to causes of crime, so I think what you mentioned about what sort of people online are saying, frankly, like there's a lot of truth to a lot of that. I think it sounds a bit soft. I think the better way of putting it is because I don't like it when people say like, oh, well, the person that guy who murdered someone, he was like really a good person, and it's only because society failed him. The way I like to think of it is like there's a lot of people out there who are potential criminals, but who don't commit crimes because there's like a structure of incentives in their lives that basically make it too costly for them. So I kind of look at it the other way around. I'm like, there's plenty of people in the world who are like not good people who would commit serious crimes if they could get away with it. But basically they can't get away with it, or it's not worth the cost to their own professional lives and their own social lives. So they don't do it. I think that's what the difference is.
Yeah. And I mean, it's that really annoying argument that people always use for almost anything where it's just like, well, if you stopped all these things, then I think crime would still happen because there are bad people. Yeah, there are bad people, but I also think there are a lot of people that would do it out of circumstance and only circumstance. So it's the whole, letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I do think, well, when it comes to a lot of like, if someone's like shoplifting food from a grocery store, or they're selling like shoplifted items to kind of make money, I understand why people would end up in that position. I feel less sympathetic when it comes to murder. It's like someone grew up in a bad household and then they ended up murdering someone. I just, I think at the end of the day, you still killed someone. So the way I look at it is like there's a lot of people who could potentially kill other people, but they don't do it because in their life circumstance, it's not worth it. Whereas for a lot of people who are in bad life circumstance, it is worth it to them. So we'll go over a few causes. Social isolation, when it comes specifically to mass shootings, which is a very small subset of crimes, but there's this article that looks at, there's this study that looks at these events, and one of the biggest indicators leading up to it is social isolation. So a lot of these people, these people who commit these acts, like they're never like the quarterback of the football team. Like when was the last time that happened? Like they're always someone who's like basically like completely isolated, and they're like going down weird internet rabbit holes. Yeah, so I mean, social isolation is a huge thing. Lower education is a huge thing that correlates with crime. There's an argument, according to this University of Chicago Press article, that one of the big reasons why education reduces crime, it's not necessarily even, that you learn a lot and it provides opportunities. It's that you're basically, it's called dynamic incapacitation. You're literally like not on the streets when you're in school. So you're just like busy doing school stuff. And that alone has enough of an effect to reduce crime. And, when it comes to demographics, it's, crime, especially violent crime, is overwhelmingly, a problem related to young men. When it comes to violent crime, 81, according to this textbook that I found, 81% of all arrests for violent crime are men, 63% for property crime are men. They argue that has to do with socialization. Perhaps one thing I'll add is this trend exists across every society, basically. So it seems like a pretty universal thing. So that kind of makes me wonder, like, is there something more going on there? When it comes to age, so people aged 15 to 24 are 14% of the population, but they're 40% of arrests related to crimes. So they're 2.5 times more likely to commit crimes compared to their share of the population. And quite literally, a lot of people age out of crime. They reach a point where they just get too old for it. And they just like, it's almost like, like going out to like, go clubbing or like go watch a movie or something. Like you eventually reach a point where you're just like, I just want to stay home. And, and the same thing happens with crime. Like a lot of criminals, they just reach a point where they're like, I'm just not feeling
anymore.
So like,
it's way better to just watch Netflix.
And interestingly, so the same demographic that kind of commits the most crimes are also the ones who are most often the victims of crime. So there's this think tank that talks about, the disproportionate rates of young men of color caught up in the criminal justice system, but also little recognition is given to the fact that young men of color are also more likely to be the victims of crime and violence. So when it comes to crime, typically people who perpetrate crimes perpetrate it against their contemporaries, people in their own communities who are kind of the same demographics as themselves. So young men commit all the crimes. They're also the victims of crimes much more often than not. Personality traits. So there's a paper that and these are all kind of individual level. We'll also look at societal level things later. But there's this review that looks at the link between individual personality traits and criminality. So these different people, I think this is a paper from Malaysia, but they look at different personality traits that correlate. And they say psychopathy, low self-control, and difficult temperament, which probably means disagreeableness. Those can correlate with crime. When it comes to mental health, so most mental health issues don't correlate with criminal behavior, but
really,
certain personality disorders do. So there's three. So there's three clusters. Do you know a lot about like personality disorders?
I mean, I know probably as much as the next guy, but no expert.
Yeah. So there's 3 clusters. Basically, cluster A is called autoerocentric disorders. And there's 3 subtypes, 3 disorders connected to it. And paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder. Cluster B is emotional or erratic disorders. Antisocial personality disorder, which is, essentially psychopathy, borderline personality, histrionic personality, narcissistic personality. And then cluster C is anxious or fearful disorders. So avoidant personality, dependent personality, obsessive compulsive personality. And it seems like cluster B does seem to correlate with certain criminal behaviors. So,
that makes sense. Yeah.
So there's this paper in the Journal of Education, Humanities, and Social Sciences called The Effect of Different Personality Disorders on Criminal Behavior. And it says only 5.7% of the general population has cluster A disorders, 1.5 B, 6% C. But cluster B disorders appear to be the most prevalent among criminals, despite having the lowest prevalence in the general population. Furthermore, it says in prison, the total percentage of people with personality disorders often exceeds 50% and can reach as high as 89%. So two of those cluster B disorders, narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, they're also part of this thing called the dark triad, which are 3 traits that often correlate with, negative behaviors. So it is what it is. Perhaps not surprising. Interestingly enough, the same personality traits are much more prevalent in internet trolls. So people who become trolls on the internet are similar personalities to people who commit serious crimes. When it comes to drug abuse, I don't find this surprising. So there is a correlation between substance abuse and criminal activity. This doesn't mean if you abuse substances that you're going to be a criminal, but especially it says alcohol was found to be associated with violent crimes more than any illegal drug. In about half of all homicides and assaults, the offender, victim, or both were reported to have been drinking. So, this isn't surprising if you've ever been to like a bar district. Like there's a bunch of people, a lot of times you'll see fist fights outside, and that doesn't happen during the day at a grocery store. You don't really see people getting fist fights.
Not sure often. No.
I've never seen it. I'm sure there's videos on YouTube. But
there are also more people that abuse alcohol than probably any other substance. So
yeah, so I don't know
have something to do with that.
Which I'm definitely not pushing the sort of every drug will make you a criminal.
What I'm saying there is like if you were to normalize, given that you take this substance, you are more or less likely to commit a violent crime. There are a ton of people that drink casually or drink too much, probably way more than people that do other illicit substances.
Yeah. So, it's like, I don't want to imply like we should, because I know drug policy is very controversial. Like for example,
that was one of the circle jerk arguments that I always see online is, well, I'm only a criminal because I wanted to get high, or I wanted to deal drugs because people want to get high, but it wouldn't be a crime. If it wasn't a crime, then no harm, no foul, nothing would have happened.
Yeah, I think it's a bit outside the scope of this episode to talk about drug policy. But it seems like at the minimum, alcohol does seem to correlate with assault. Brain injury, unfortunately, it says this article from which paper is this? So this is from the Lancet, I believe. But it says, we show how TBI is a risk factor for earlier, more violent offending. TBI is linked to poor engagement and treatment, et cetera, et cetera.
Where TBI is traumatic brain injury. I don't know if you said that.
Yeah. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a criminal, but it does seem to be a thing that tends to be a risk factor.
Yeah, kind of the same way, just smoking a cigarette won't give you cancer, but they're pretty linked.
Yeah. And then there's an article, so this is from the National Institute of Justice, which is part of the U.S. Department of Justice, and they talk about studies, they look at multiple studies basically showing a very high rate of childhood trauma among criminals. And then there's this, it's just when you look at the rate of people experiencing trauma in their youth, it's very overrepresented in the criminal population. And then finally, there's this paper from Cambridge that looks at, do your family members commit crimes? And it says, the observed familiarity. So basically, we found strong familial aggregation of interpersonal violence among first-degree relatives, lower for more distant relatives. And so there seems to be, a case to be made that crime, is it genetic or is it environmental? It's hard to say, but regardless, if you come from a family with a lot of criminals, that does increase your chances of becoming a criminal as well. So I think, to put it lightly, when you look at the profile of people who become criminals, you're talking about people who don't grow up in great environments, I think, is to put it lightly. I don't know if that tracks or not. Basically, you're talking about people who are, basically on the fringes of society. They're often not educated. They're young men who are less educated, socially isolated, don't have a lot of opportunities, might have, personality trait issues, might have substance abuse issues, might have brain injuries, might have trauma from their childhoods. That's what you tend to see when it comes to people who commit serious crimes. There are exceptions. There are the cases of someone who grew up in a normal family and then they went crazy, but that's not the norm. And when you think about your own experience, how many people do you know who just grew up in a normal environment and then they went crazy and started murdering a bunch of people?
I can't say I know anybody. No.
Yeah. So, I want to stress again, I think people ultimately are responsible for their decisions, but when those correlative factors exist, you have to acknowledge that. When it comes to social, societal level problems, interestingly enough, there's a pretty compelling evidence that crime increases after wars end. So there's this article from the 70s.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, so there's Violent Acts and Violent Times, a comparative approach to post-war homicide rates. This is from Dane Archer and Rosemary Gartner, 1976, from UC Santa Cruz. And then there was sort of a follow-up study following up on this research by this other group of people, Stamatel, I probably mispronounced that, and Romans, from the Journal of Contemporary Criminal Justice, and they basically kind of verified the research. But basically, after a war ends, you see crime rates go up. And my view on this is it kind of makes sense. You have a group of people who commit violence in the name of, defending your country or some sort of foreign policy reason. Even if the war is justified, you're still talking about a large population of people who experience violence and who committed violence. And a small percentage of those people will probably end up becoming criminals, right? Not most of them, but some of them. And I just think, I believe in the post-Civil War era, you saw some of that. And crime actually went up from the 1950s all the way to the 70s or 80s or so. Crime steadily went up before they started going down in the 90s. So some people say, was that post World War II?
Did we see any uptick in violent crimes after Iraq and Afghanistan, or are we just in the middle of being able to measure that?
I don't think so. For some reason. I think those were smaller wars. At the end of the day, when you look at
relative to Korea, Vietnam, World War II, they were smaller, and that is also the first major war we've had after the volunteer service.
Mm-hmm. So
that might be part of it.
Yeah, and then when it comes to economic factors, it's similar to the individual factors, economically speaking. So there's this paper by Phillips and Land, which looks at economic activity as indexed by the aggregate unemployment rate. And it shows that basically there are relationships between crime and the unemployment rate. And there's also a paper by there's also a paper that looks at inequality specifically. And basically what they found, so there's this paper in the Journal of Economic Structures, and they look at the growth, inequality, poverty triangle. So they look at these three factors. So growth is economic growth, inequality is income inequality, and then poverty is basically, we all know what poverty is. So interestingly, shows there's no relationship between per capita income and crime rate. So low income itself does not lead to high crime, but you do see a U-shaped relationship between poverty headcount and per capita income, and inverted U-shaped relationship between income inequality and economic growth. And so it says income inequality and unemployment rate increases crime rate, while trade openness supports decreased crime rate. So inequality seems to be the big factor that really increases crime. Not necessarily, because even very poor Americans, very often have cars, and they don't have, they're not in a great situation. But when you think about a very poor American compared to someone growing up in a developing country, usually poor Americans are better off. But there seems to be something psychologically about the inequality where somebody else is vastly wealthier than you, and not having the means to kind of cross that gap. There's something about that seems to increase crime rate, interestingly enough. And I think because I don't think in Southeast Asia or there's certain poor areas of the world where you see poverty, but it doesn't seem like it leads to massively high crime rates. So
yeah,
I found that.
And that's something I saw in a lot of the Reddit forums, that people didn't say just poverty, they said inequality more than poverty.
Yeah, and then there's this paper in the Journal of Injury Epidemiology, and it looks at zip code based results. And it says lower median household income at the zip code level contributed more to homicide rate, but income inequality at the state level was additionally significant when controlling for both zip code and state level factors. So it seems like state level inequality has a big influence, but within those states with high inequality, the lower income zip codes have higher crime rates. So that kind of more or less confirms what we just said previous. There's something about that just leads to crime. And then again, education at a higher level, it just shows education reduces crime. Family structure. So, according to the Department of Justice, single parent families have much higher crime rates. I don't know to what degree that's because of other factors. Is this correlation or is it causation? It's hard to say, but that's just what the data shows, is that, it's just a risk factor. And then interestingly, this article, I found indicates that, impunity, when it comes to criminal justice, impunity, the feeling that you basically can do something and get away with it, does seem to, be higher in higher crime areas. And urbanization. So this is,
how did they measure impunity?
I think it was it might have just been a survey-based thing.
Because that seems like a hard thing to measure.
Based on factors such as institutional strength and other structural conditions for 69 countries worldwide. So this is a think tank that's focused specifically on crime in Latin America. But that seems to be like, basically, if you can commit crimes and know you'll get away with it, that obviously seems to increase the crime level. All right, so that's it for this episode. We're gonna pick off where we left off next episode. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next episode.